So believe it or not, there may be a violent video game tax that could be issued pretty soon here in Mexico. It's kind of crazy. It kind of reminds me of like the concept of a sugar tax. This is a tax on video games that are considered really, really violent. They're very naughty. They have blood and guts and gore and punching and all that violent stuff. Yeah, so some people with a keen eye saw this in a document that is released annually every year in Mexico. Around this same time, it is called the General Economic Policy Guidelines, and it's always for the next year. So the 2026 document just dropped. It's about 93 pages. Very, very long. There's a lot of different stuff, different economic proposals, that sort of thing. So the whole thing is not about video games, obviously, but that is a very small part of it. And that's talked about right here on this Insider Gaming article. I have linked this and the actual document in the description if you want to go through either of those. And this all just happened today, Friday, October 17th. So it says Mexico's government has moved another step closer to putting a tax on video games it deems to be violent. So today, on Friday, Mexico's Chamber of Deputies approved a financial package that includes an 8% tax on violent video games. Yeah, so essentially last month, these guidelines dropped, and in that, it said that there was this proposed 8% tax on video games that are violent. And today, Mexico's Chamber of Deputies actually passed this, and now it is going on to Mexico Senate. And so we'll actually see if it gets approved there. But yeah, it's not actually in law right now anyway, but it could be in the very near future. So it says back when this was first proposed last month in early September, the claim was that recent studies have found a relationship between the use of violent video games and higher levels of aggression among adolescents, as well as negative social and psychological effects such as isolation and anxiety. This was said without providing any examples of those studies. Yeah, it's one of those claims that gets pushed around a lot, that video games are going to make you go out and do bad things, when studies don't really show this, from what I have seen anyway. In fact, there's a lot of studies that show that video games can, in certain ways, be good for your mental health. So it's kind of funny when stuff like this gets pushed, but anyway, as I said, the document is like 93 pages long, so if you go to the document, this was the proposed economic package that was pushed out last month. You go to page 36 here, this is where they talk about the video game tax, and I tried translating the actual document itself so that you could see what the PDF looked like just with English. I couldn't do that for some reason. It didn't want to work, so I just copied and pasted it into a Google Doc and I translated it. So sorry, the formatting's kind of weird here, but I just specifically cropped out the part that it talks about violent video games and the proposed tax. So it says, on the other hand, recent studies have found a relationship between the use of nature video games, that's a translation issue, the nature of violent video games, I think they mean to say that, and a higher level of aggression among adolescents, as well as social and psychological effects that are negative, such as isolation and anxiety. And they also talk about gambling, and I don't know if this is specifically gambling video games or just gambling in general, but they talk about the effects of that. So they say, as a result of the above, the government of Mexico will implement measures for extra fiscal purposes. And they list a few different bullet points here that they want to impose, and then this is the big one right here. So one of the things here, it says, establish a special ad valorem tax of 8%, and ad valorem is just a standard, you can just kind of ignore that. It just basically means an 8% tax on all video games, regardless on how they are priced. And they want to put this on the provision of digital video game services with violent content, and then they go on to talk about a gambling tax as well, which is still pretty important. I'm just not as interested in that. Now, Insider Gaming, in that article, they give a little bit more insight here. They say this new tax would apply to all games, both physical and digital. Now it says, and I didn't see this in the document of the parts that I translated, but it said for free-to-play titles, and this is very relevant today, the 8% tax would apply to in-game purchases and microtransactions. Now, I think kind of the big question here, what does Mexico deem as a violent video game? I mean, technically, like Super Smash Bros. Or Banjo-Kazooie, that could be a violent video game. I mean, so what are we determining here? So it says, according to the proposal, the tax would apply to games rated C and D under the Mexican system of equivalences of video game content classification. Now, when comparing this to the ESRB in the US, a C rating is for players 18 plus, while a D rating is for games rated for adults only. Now, that's kind of funny. I think those two things on the surface are kind of the same thing. I mean, 18 plus is adult adult only, pretty much. And I didn't really get that at first, but when breaking it down, it looks like basically a C rating is going to be most of your M-rated games in the US, like your GTA, your Call of Duty. I mean, kind of just those standard games when you think of an M-rated game. Whereas the adults-only games, I think those are like your, the spicy content, the actual NSFW games. So that's where we're at with this. Again, this is going to get pushed on to the Senate. One funny thing that crossed my mind is that why is this just violence? I mean, I don't think in general this should happen at all. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't want them to put a tax on violent video games. I think this is kind of dumb, just me personally looking at it. But it's like, if they are going to do this, I don't know why they are singling out violent video games. I mean, what about a game that just has all nudity and no violence at all? It's just strictly nudity and drugs and swearing, but no punching. I mean, like, what about those video games? And that's what's funny. I mean, they're singling out the violent video games, but I think this is just applying to all games with a high rating on like the ESRB equivalent scale, games that are C and D rated, as I said. So it's funny that they're just singling out that this is due to violent video games when some of these C and D rated games couldn't even have maybe violence in it at all. Again, they go back to it being because there's a link between violent video games and aggression in adolescence, but I just don't see the studies that are proving that. But regardless, this is now moving on to the Mexican Senate. So if that actually happens, if this really gets serious and this does actually pass, we'll see what this tax actually looks like and how the people really do react to this.